Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Abby, if we can go and just go through the agenda, so what we can walk the audience through how we're going to run the next hour and a bit. So first of all, welcome everyone. My name is Frank Aswani, as I've mentioned. I'm the CEO at AVPA. As you all may know, or those of us who are joining us for the first time, we are a Pan-African network of social investors mobilizing grants, debt, or equity into the impact space. We aim to address the SDG financing gap in Africa. We have our headquarters in Nairobi and offices in Johannesburg and Lagos. And we support investors through a couple of different ways. We connect them to each other and to investable pipeline. We help them learn. So we do a lot of sessions like these. We also do a lot of work on our Leadership Development Center, where we run programs like the Impact Investing Fellowship Program that's currently running. We also have two exciting other programs that will be coming up, one in healthcare for healthcare investors, another one for climate finance. So we're going to be running arguably Africa's first impact investing program for climate investors. And then also we'll also be doing quite a bit on the sides of catalytic capital and how do we address the issue of lack of risk capital, because the world of impact is not so much about not having capital. It's really about not having enough risk capital. So look out for some exciting things that we shall be doing. And then we also help you to magnify the impact and the influence you can have on the greater impact community in the continent, and then scale some of your learnings and inventions. So that's basically how we support investors. We're now open for membership. We officially opened up for membership about 2 months ago. So those of you who've got an interest in joining AVP as a member, by all means, please do reach out to us. We'll happily see how we can plug you into what is arguably Africa's growing and largest impact network. So we'll then do an audience poll in a short while. So please get your cell phones ready. Those of you who've been with us before, you know we use Slido. So we'll have your cell phones ready, and then I'll go into my conversations with Tom. And then we'll take about 25 to 30 minutes to do some Q&R at the end, questions and reflections. But as we go through the conversation with Tom, please do put in your questions in the chat group or any of your reflections in the chat group. We'll try and come to as many of them as possible. And we tend to close in about an hour and 20 minutes from now. So thank you very much for coming. As I mentioned, there's some exciting things coming up from AVPA. One of the things that we're super excited about in this attempt to grow the amount of risk capital in the continent, we'll be launching a conversation on philanthropic pool funds. Those of you who want to be part of lack of a better word, a consortium of people who want to look at philanthropic pool funds, please join us on 12th September. And then there's a couple of other programs that are currently running. We've just released a mapping study on the state of innovative finance in South Africa. You can find it on our website. There's an Africa Climate Investing Forum, which I mentioned to you is an impact investing program for climate investors on the continent. Also look out for catalytic investing training program that's upcoming, and we're opening up for membership. So do check us out on our events page or follow us on LinkedIn. I'd love to for sure connect with many of you. And if you do want to connect with us directly, info@avpa is where you'll find us. Okay, and send us an email and we will commit to coming back to you. So without further ado, Abby, can we jump into the Slido poll? Please do have your cell phones ready, and either you go to slido.com or use your cell phones to follow through the QR code and follow and answer the question that will be that will be coming up shortly. So how familiar are you with the concept of impact economy? Some of you may have read the paper that we sent out and the report that we shall be discussing with you. So it'd be good for Tom to see kind of where you guys sit in terms of your knowledge on this space. So how familiar are you with the concept of the impact economy? So 19 people have polled. So use your camera, your phones to the QR code. Okay, another 20 seconds. Okay. Okay, somewhat familiar, very familiar, not familiar at all. So we see that maybe 60 or so percent with you are either somewhat familiar or not familiar at all, and about 40% are very familiar. Okay, that's pretty cool. Abby, can we take the next question? So do you believe that businesses have a responsibility to contribute to solving social and environmental issues? Let's take another 30, 45 seconds to respond to this. Okay. Overwhelmingly, people think that businesses do. It will be interesting to see people who work in corporates and businesses, whether their practice internally is actually aligned to these sentiments being expressed here. All right, cool. Oh. Okay, Abby, I think we can stop the poll and move on to introduce Tom. Tom, I'm really happy for you to make time to join us today. Tom is the Global Head for Social Impact and Philanthropy at UBS. I won't go through every single line of his bio. It's rich on its own. Super impressive. I first heard Tom talk in a conference in Malaysia about 2 months ago, and I thought 2-3 months ago, and I thought it would be really cool if he comes and speaks to the African audience. So Tom, welcome. Thank you so much for making time to be with us today.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thanks for the invite. And great to see so many people join today who are all passionate about impact.
Yes, yes. I think the African impact space is a growing and evolving space. It's one where we are seeing incremental interest. We're seeing so many more people showing real commitment in not only wanting to know more, but wanting to actively participate. But so Tom, let me start off with a question around, please help us understand when you talk about an impact economy, please define that for us. What does that mean?
Sure. So, I mean, before I get into that definition, I'll just rewind ever so quickly. For those of you who don't know, UBS is the world's largest wealth manager. We manage about $5 trillion worth of client capital, and we bank about 65% of the world's billionaires. And it's been my privilege over the last decade or so to maybe advise 3,000 or so of those clients. And what we've seen over the years is just exponential wealth creation, and many wealthy individuals and capital holders and allocators moving more and more into the philanthropy space, into the impact space. In fact, we surveyed our clients just towards the end of the last year. Interesting to see your survey that you just did, Frank. And 95% of our billionaire clients said that they felt it was their responsibility to either contribute or solve the pressing social and environmental problems the world's facing. And we often use, I think, like you do, the Sustainable Development Goals as a proxy for that. And what do they mean by that? Well, they mean they want to use their philanthropy. That's an element for sure. They want to use their investing, and they want to use their operating company. So when I have been advising these people over the last 10 years, and my team's about 140 people now globally, which gives you a sense of how important this is to UBS as a business, as a differentiator actually to other wealth management services. We think this is critical to our clients, so we've invested in it. The question we ask is, well, can we solve these issues? Like how do we actually fulfill this client demand for impact that people want to see solutions to the world's problems? And the answer we came to is basically, unless we radically rethink how our entire economy is structured, we won't get there. So at the heart of the impact economy is this idea that we need to move away from a simple output-based GDP-focused economy, and we need to start working towards, and in fact, I think it's already happening, and we'll give you some examples of that, whereby we actually genuinely value, both in monetary terms And obviously from a social perspective, people and planet in the heart of all investments. So that when capital flows, it doesn't just flow according to output-based economics. It delivers that triple bottom line of risk, return, and impact. That's what we think we need to see. But there's, that's a big job trying to build an impact economy. And I think part of the way that we have started to think about this, and it's not our term, I think Ronnie Cohen might have been the first to start using this, one of the big kind of godfathers of impact investing maybe 15 years ago. And others have started to use it as well. It's almost like a proxy for net zero, which many people might be familiar with. Like, how do we think about the structural things we need to do in our economy so that we can, build an impact economy? And I guess the question for us is, why do we want to do that as well? Well, I think there's two answers to that. If we build an impact economy, then whatever that funding gap is for the Sustainable Development Goals, 4.7 trillion a year, 30 trillion between now and 2030. We think that can get funded, right? We can find the capital to meet the Sustainable Development Goals first and foremost. But it's not just about meeting those goals because that's the right thing to do from a moral perspective. It's also about the economic argument of making sure we meet those goals. And I think it's really important to make it clear that if we can build an impact economy, if we can meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we think we can add 380 million new jobs to the global economy and add 12 trillion of value, right? So it's actually win-win. It's good for everybody if we can build an economy that has profit, people, and planet at its heart. And that's the fundamental big idea for an impact economy.
Yeah, and you mentioned profit, people, and planet. There's people sometimes have this perception that to do impact you've got to lose money. And that's not right. Am I correct in making that answer that profit and purpose are not mutually exclusive? You can do well as you do good.
I think there's absolutely the case that you can. I think what we also just have to be cognizant of is the function of time, right? So today, the impact investment industry, where again there's lots of demand. So I suppose the question is like, how do we build an impact economy, right? The one way you definitely can't do it is with philanthropy. You cannot give people free education or healthcare. There's 500 million people who can't read or do basic literacy. The economic impact of that is just unfathomable. I remember I was at an event at the Vatican towards the end of last year when Jeff Bezos was sharing his personal story. And he was saying, and I promise that's my only name drop, but it's a good story, so I'll share it. But what he was saying was that his dad was an illiterate Cuban migrant who came to the States at 15. And if it hadn't been for the education he'd received, it happened to be a faith school, hence the Vatican link, Jeff wouldn't be where he was today. Like, that intergenerational power of education led to entrepreneurship, led to value creation. Now, you may argue about Amazon and its social footprint, whatever. That, I'm not getting into that debate. But the point is that there's so many people out there who are not achieving their full potential because we haven't worked out a way to finance that. That's just one SDG, education at scale, particularly in tertiary education. And philanthropy can't solve for that, right? Philanthropy, we think, is going to grow from about 2 trillion to 10 trillion over the next 15 years. Forbes came out with an article at the end of last year that kind of validated that. Exactly when is obviously a function of how long people live who've been this kind of experienced this huge intergenerational wealth creation over the last 30 years. But for sure, more money is going into philanthropy, but 10 trillion is not 30, right? So if we try and give people free healthcare, if we try and give people free education, the money runs out. So what's absolutely clear is we have to find investable pathways to solve these big issues, right? And there it's a function of, well, where can I invest and how much risk am I taking? What kind of return am I going to get? Today, and we've seen a lot of interest in trying to drive impact investing. Impact investing is about $1 trillion today. Okay, so I don't mean to denigrate that at all. I think that's good progress, but it's not 30 trillion. And why is that? And I think part of the issue is actually it is hard to find what many people call market risk adjusted return opportunities where the impact is needed the most. So when we start to look at things like the Sustainable Development Goals, a large proportion of the burden of the Sustainable Development Goals is in low middle income countries, right? And actually, to invest and get a market risk adjusted return in a low middle income country, there's almost 103 trillion in the wealth management industry alone, 80% of which says it wants to have sustainable impact or sustainability linked goals or impact linked goals, particularly women, particularly next gen wealth inheritors. Yet the capital's not flowing. Why is it not flowing? Because it wants to have those goals, impact, but it also wants to get a market risk adjusted return. But if you're trying to invest in a country like Kenya, for example, we were looking at doing an investment in an oxygen business in Kenya before COVID, actually, to boost oxygen supply in maternal and child health. And that business could afford to pay a 9% dollar return. Its open market cost of capital was 27. So what happened? Capital didn't flow, right? So I think what we're seeing a lot is that you can make a return, you can drive impact, but capital's not flowing because the level of return is deemed to be not sufficient for the risk that's being taken. And I think that is where, when we start to think about building an impact economy, we need to be much smarter in terms of how we get the different actors in the impact economy to work together differently so that they can actually make capital flow.
Okay, interesting. So I want to dive a bit into the report, and I'm hoping all of you have had a chance to look at the report. If you haven't, it's just been posted in the chat. So please do find some time and read it. So Tom, the report speaks about the need to transition from an output to an impact economy. Can you please contrast these two, highlighting the key differences?
Yeah. So look, in an output-based economy, all that matters is your investment, your cost, your activities, and then whether you're going to generate revenue. But you're not necessarily counting the costs, the negative externalities of those investments, both longitudinally to your own business line, but also to society. And you're also not valuing things that are valuable. So let me just give you, a really practical example. In the UK, which maybe is not the case in some larger countries, but we're just in an island. We have been building out on greenbelt, on land that normally is rich with biodiversity. And I was with the RSPB recently, and they were saying to me that we are between 10 to 15 years away from having to hand pollinate our fruit and vegetables, right? So the cost of building out on greenbelt is not actually being properly calculated in how the economy is the risk rewards of the economy is structured. Now, that's one of those things that perhaps has to be fixed through regulation. You have to actually price in the cost. And another way of actually thinking about an example like that is, can you create transfer of value for upside? So the flip way of thinking of that particular concept is, if people develop upwards in existing cities, and in the process of doing so, reintroduce biodiversity, for example, they reintroduce bees or bird life, and that has a knock-on effect on the cost of agricultural production, then is there a way of rewarding them? Is there a way of creating transfer of value? And perhaps one of the most common examples, where we start to already see the emergence of what we think are key pillars, and it's in the paper around incentives for the impact economy, is things like carbon markets. Now, there's issues with carbon markets. They're not perfectly priced. There's different prices depending on what you think your consumers want you to pay per cost of carbon, but it's a starting point, right? We're trying to say we think that a ton of carbon has this value, and we're willing to create that transfer of value to somebody in order for them to actually generate revenue for the impact that they're driving in their business. And again, I saw this really, really starkly in Vietnam recently with a group of smallholder mangrove farmers, and they were actually shrimp fishermen inside the mangrove, and they maybe had 3 hectares on average, and they were chopping down a whole hectare of mangrove in order to increase their production of shrimp, not knowing actually that the quality of shrimp went down if you degrade your mangrove for about $500, right, for firewood, essentially. In an impact economy, that would never happen, because we know that 65 tons of carbon has got more value than $500 one-off, right? And if you can create that transfer of value, if you can create a system whereby that works, then actually shrimp production inside mangrove forests starts to become an investable opportunity. And I think it's about this kind of, going back to your question, can we always have a return and an investment? Well, in certain categories, maybe not yet, because we don't know what works. And at the moment, actually finding an investable business model that really safeguards, sustainable aquaculture in the coastal marine ecosystems in the world, we don't think there is a viable investment opportunity at the moment. Does that mean we give up? No, it means we use the precious resource of philanthropic capital to ideate, to test, to innovate. And that's where we think, and Bill Gates often says this, like, philanthropy is the risk capital of risk capitals. If we can use philanthropic capital to expedite what the market wouldn't do on its own, then we think we can start to create investable opportunities faster that the market can then scale. And that's, I think, probably the classic example in all of our minds today is the mRNA vaccine, right? mRNA vaccine is not something that the big pharma companies would have invested in on their own, off their own backs necessarily, because it may not never have paid off. There's several hundred million put in by Gates Foundation, many others, into Oxford in particular, to front run the technology there. And that's paid off hugely because that was being scaled by the market. And I think that pathway between ideation and then thinking with scale in mind is critical. And where philanthropy can be smarter, and in fact, what many people don't know is that the original contract with Oxford University in that use of catalytic capital was a share in the upside of future sales of any mRNA vaccine. So they've actually made more money back now. So you can be really smart in how you allocate philanthropy, but it can still play this outsized risk role in the impact economy. And I think that's where it's also important to think not all capital is seeking, returns in the same way. Philanthropic capital actually, as a standard, is prepared to be given away as long as it's got guaranteed impact associated with it, right? So we should use that intent. People are wanting to drive solutions faster, but we should use that in combination with other forms of capital, then try and find vehicles and pathways to drive scale.
Yeah, and it's that I strongly believe that philanthropic capital is a bridesmaid in this whole attempt of unlocking more capital. And there's an evolving role of philanthropists in this space for them to really play a catalytic role in helping test new markets, new products, new services that can then be scaled by the people who've got a lot more money, who tend to be more commercial kind of players. So I totally agree with you in the context that we have a really pivotal role that philanthropists need to play in trying to unlock more capital for impact, because the innovation still needs to be funded and more commercial capital is not going to be there. That's why the risk-seeking capital like philanthropy is best suited for that. So on the report, Tom, there's a line that really intrigued me. It says, humans have been borrowing on the environmental card with no thought about how the bill would be paid. Do you think we truly appreciate the impact of continuing in this impact, in this kind of output economy mode? Are we just going to be just consumers who are insensitive to the impact space? Do you think we truly appreciate the impact of continuing the path we're on at the moment?
I don't think we do. I think many people were shocked at the idea. I mean, we think inflation's been bad in the last couple of years. If we end up with the biodiversity crisis, that means you have to hand pollinate your food. I mean, that is pretty cataclysmic, right? There are issues there that need to be resolved. I do think that there is an awareness of that, just as there has been with an awareness to net zero. I think the reality is that there is no easy solution, and the trade-offs and navigating towards this new way in which the economy will function is going to take all of us to work together in partnerships and really think smartly about both the kind of the phasing and the incentives and the regulations that will be required in order to then allow capital to flow where it needs to flow, and also, as you were saying before, building up that pipeline of opportunities to even be invested in that can deliver impact that's verifiable and proven, and also deliver returns. So, I think often until I think I saw a report yesterday that pretty much every part of the globe has been affected by climate change in the last over the summer, right? And if you have a summer, and so it's hard to deny these things. Yet at the same time, there are still people who do, and I think there are also still, I think there are still just unknown unknowns. What is clear is that we need to fix the fundamental levers of how we calculate what success looks like if we're going to be able to start building a system that can actually flex and respond to it.
Yeah, and Ritha, who talks about a colleague using the term courageous capital to describe philanthropic capital that's acts in this place. At the launch of AVPA 6 or so 8 weeks ago, one of our guest speakers described catalytic capital as capital that cares. And I thought that was a very apt description. Yeah, it cares enough to take chances with the view not of failure, but if it succeeds, the impact will be huge. And I thought that was a really apt way of trying to unpack what catalytic capital is about. So, Tom, when you think about what has to happen to enhance the growth and adoption of impact economies, what do we need to do to get this right?
So I think, there's a number of things. I think the first reflection actually that I have, and it's almost a frustration, is we believe that the capital both from a revenue perspective and from an investment perspective, is there in the economy to build an impact economy, to meet the sustainable development goals. So again, you take the 10 trillion that might be in philanthropy, okay, that's insufficient to solve the issue, but it's a lot of potential catalytic capital that can take those kind of initial positions in innovation, or as we'll probably touch on later in the conversation, things like blended finance instruments. There's ways of transferring risk to drive that. There's 103 trillion in the wealth management industry, as I mentioned, right? There's a huge amount of potential investor profile, but it's just not moving. So we need to get those bits to talk to each other and start working together. And then the other dimension I think we don't talk about enough is public money. Globally, there's about 32 trillion spent every year on social goods, if you like, education, healthcare, by governments. And if we could have done a little straw poll, but I've yet to ask this question and have more than maybe one hand go up, possibly in Singapore. How many people believe that their government is spending public money on the right things consistently, on evidence-based interventions, is really driving impact with that precious resource, right? And of course, the way economies work is, if an economy is successful, it has more resources to spend on public benefits. That's how the social contract should work. So it's really important that we start to think about how can we get those kind of tripartite partnerships of philanthropic and catalytic capital working with investment capital in partnership, either from a policy perspective or through transfer of value, actually partnering with governments directly. And I think that's something that we're starting to see a lot of examples of, and actually is quite an interesting opportunity when we start to think of transfer of value and revenue, actual revenue for impact, which is going to be a critical component of the impact economy. I would say, if I was to distill it to two things that need to happen, one is that partnership word, people working together consistently, driving focused outcomes on impact. And I think too often we use the word impact loosely. And I actually think I've worked with, as I said, thousands of wealthy individuals, some of whom are very sophisticated philanthropists who allocate billions of dollars to their philanthropy, who've never made an impact investment. And the reason they don't make impact investments is because they don't believe in the data of the quality of the impact, right? And I think that this risk of impact washing is a real barrier, actually, to capital flowing. It's also, over and above that, a problem if you can't measure and value the true impact, like a ton of carbon or an educated child. You can't pay for it, so you can't create transfer of value. So we think impact transparency and real clarity about what impact is occurring, to the extent that A causes B, is critical as a kind of building block of the impact economy. And really, one of the things we and many others are advocating for is trying to simplify, because I know lots of people are, we know lots of people are involved in working on the impact measurement, but often they're proprietary systems. They're 70 pages long, and most of the capital allocators I know don't have time to read that, right? So I think one of the areas that we think is really important is to simplify and focus on three dimensions, really. The first is the evidence of impact, and I come back to that point about a vaccine. The reason we took a vaccine is because it had been through a randomized control trial. It was absolute proof that A causes B. We know it works, right? In many fields of human endeavor, we don't have that level of proof. We have, sometimes a baseline end line, sometimes it's correlated, but it's not that degree of proof. And in some contexts, there's good reasons for that. There's structural reasons for that in the economy. In the healthcare sector, you can't make any money if you don't have a control trial, because you won't get approval from your drug administrator, right? But in education, you can go and come up with a new philosophy that you think teaches kids and they learn. You don't have to have any proof necessarily. That depends on the policy environment of the government you're operating in. So burden of proof and the quality of evidence is critical. Focus on intention of impact and who's being impacted is critical, because I think one of the other issues we've seen is that the $1 trillion or so that's currently in the impact investment industry, some of that might have that gold standard of evidence, but it will be focused primarily on developed countries. I'm not saying that's wrong. It's great to save a life anywhere. But if we know we need to get money into low and middle income countries, we need to be transparent about that, because otherwise we're not going to fix the system and see capital flowing. And we also need to see the sustainability and scale. So what we imagine is actually if you could get to a place where you have a simple bond rating that looks at these kind of core dimensions that you could put on any transfer of capital, then it would start to create the transparency framework required for investors to understand, well, this has got good evidence, this has got good intentionality, or maybe it needs to improve, but I'm going to do it anyway. And what that allows you to do is start to price and pay for the impact. And I think there's lots of different ways in which we can see impact being paid for. One way, and that was a good example in Africa, actually, the World Bank issued a bond recently whereby the investors themselves essentially agreed to pay for the impacts if it could be proven. And in this context, they were being paid, I think, say a 4% yield on their bond if there was no impact, or a 2% yield plus the rest of their yield was going to be paid in rhinos if the rhino population increased, right? Now, not everybody wants to buy that because they don't want to be paid in rhinos. But for some people who love rhinos, that's a good deal. They want to be paid in rhinos. And I think we need to think more creatively around, how we can actually explain the value of that. In fact, I was speaking to somebody just today who's, negotiated with a big multilateral development bank who had fiduciary duties, who couldn't allocate capital, unless it was monetary. But they managed to do a really detailed social return on investment piece of work that the bank took to mean basically a cash equivalent, and that got it over the hurdle rate. So an investment that otherwise capital wouldn't have flowed, they managed to price the actual impact value in a causal way, and that managed to add up to the return rate that the bank was looking for. So I thought that was super interesting. And the third way, of course, that and this comes back to the point about government, is we see a huge role for government to also pay for impact, either directly, and we've done a lot of work over the years in things like payment for results instruments, where government's literally paying whatever it is. Ghanaian government, we've just done a contract with them. They're paying $68 per child per year if we meet expected learning outcomes based on a standard deviation of learning gain benchmarked against a randomized controlled trial done by KPMG. It's properly scientific, extremely robust. Government pays essentially in partnership with the Education Outcomes Fund. So there's ways of doing that and getting transfer value. You can also do it through the tax system. Companies that prove out their impact maybe have a lower capital gains tax charge. There's lots of different ways in which we can actually create revenue and incentives in the impact economy that that allows us to feel comfortable that the GDP metrics, and I see there's a question in the chat, which I know we'll come to later, but GDP is still going to be an important measure, but we want to see that it's actually integrated the value of people and planet inside it as well. So I think that those kind of levers are really critical.
Yeah, and I think if I hear you correctly, Tom, we're in a space where we can try and experiment a lot of these newer approaches that connect impacts to decisions and capital that we make and deploy. Just this morning, by the way, I was in a conversation with a group of people, and we were thinking, what if we made government tenders in Africa outcome-based financing models, where people who take government tenders are only paid on verified outcomes? That would probably fight and cut a lot of corruption, because right now many people who win tenders are paid on activities and are paid upfront. Yet we know the notorious reputation that tenders and tenderpreneurs have created on the continent, where delivery has been almost nil or very poorly done. And this is, I think, a good opportunity for us to try and experiment a couple of different things. So funny enough, you mentioned the question about GDP, because I was going to bring it up right now to say, and to Alan's question is, if GDP is not the impact economy measure, what is? And what can be learned from the experience of what has been through the output economy to how we measure going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is, as I said, ultimately, it's about getting confidence that the way that we value people and planet, and obviously there's a combination of incentives and regulation, right? So, already in the EU, for example, Article 9, which is the highest standard of impact, is 100% sustainable, and Article 8 funds are outselling all other investment funds by 3.5 times. That's been driven by regulation, right? So in some senses, the concept of the impact economy is not, we're throwing everything out. It's just creating the architecture within the economy that we know that there's either the regulatory controls that allow us to feel confident that we're not having these negative externalities on our environment, on people and planet, but also creating reward for positive. And I think that's probably almost the more exciting side of this, is that if we can get to a place where we can transparently and consistently price impact, to your point, the US government they spend $1 trillion a year, and we work with some Treasury Department officials. This is on healthcare, on social services, $1 trillion a year. Do you know how much the Treasury Department officials are estimated is spent, allocated, linked to verifiable outcomes, to the standard of evidence I've described, where it's proven and causal?
Nope.
2%. 2%. One of the most sophisticated economies globally, right? So if it's an issue in the US, it's an issue everywhere. All public money needs to try and transition and find a pathway to transition to being more transparent and outcomes focused. If we can do that, what we've seen time and time again, as we've seen, governments start to adopt payment by results mechanisms, is better value for taxpayers, validated results, and then start to see improvements in the economy. And I mentioned Ghana, where they're spending $68 per child per year. The education minister, we had a group of investors would come visit in February. It was explained to us that for 20 years they've spent money on activities. They've been building schools, they've been printing textbooks, they've been training teachers. The schools look lovely. The teachers weren't implementing the training because they probably hadn't understood it properly, and the textbooks often never even arrived at the schools. So that kind of activity-based model is just deeply flawed. And what they've transitioned to, in partnership with Education Outcomes Fund, is starting to do at scale, millions of children, a payment by results mechanism. That's $30 million, I think, is the initial contract. And they're only paying if it's validated, right? And that allows, actually, interestingly, risk capital to be invested in organizations that traditionally took grants, right? They're often non-profit, sometimes a mixture. But organizations who've got proof that they can deliver impact, go in and deliver learning levels, and then they get repaid. And actually, if they over-deliver, there's an upside, right? And that's now creating a system where you've got kind of that win-win environment. Because if you have 20 years with no learning increase, what does that mean? It means you've got your core human capital is not becoming the entrepreneurs or the smarter employees that they could be and paying more tax. They're just you're stagnating, right? So your GDP, if you like, is not growing. So the impact economy should actually drive GDP growth if you get this right, because you start to ensure that public money is being spent on things that over time, what we'll hopefully see as a result of these kind of pay for success instruments in countries like Ghana is many millions of young people achieving their potential, ultimately paying more tax, and therefore the cost per child per year can go up. And that's actually a really interesting point, which I think has often been one of the restraining factors for why philanthropy has been dissipated, because we try and do everything for everybody. So as you went to this wonderful NGO, I won't say what they were called, but they were spending $200 per child per year. They were trying to feed out school kids. They were trying to do their health. They were trying to do all these different things. They were having an amazing impact for a really, really small number of people. And that's actually happened all over. So a lot of money has done that over the years. And what we have to do is make actually some of the difficult decisions to how do we actually have the right amount of impact at scale so it has an economic effect. And at $68 per child per year, even in a country like Ghana, that makes difficult choices. Every single one of the organizations we've invested in Ghana, in this education contract I'm describing, has made the difficult decision to only use all $68 on education outcomes. They're not going to pay for school meals because school meals cost $38, right? So if you use your budget to do school meals, great to get kids into school, great at getting right down to the bottom of the pyramid, but then you don't have enough money left over to spend on them actually learning. So you've got lots of well-fed kids who aren't learning. So actually making those really difficult choices around price per impact and doing it at scale hopefully means you've got, in 15 years' time, millions of better educated people contributing more to their economy. And then the government can start spending $100 per year, and maybe they can then move on to feeding programs and such like. So, these are not easy choices, but this is how we do have to think at scale, collaboratively with all of the different actors. And these kinds of models, I think, have a real opportunity to scale. But if we, again, want to think about some of the kind of institutional sides of an impact economy, how we manage public money away from, as you were saying, this kind of activity-based model, which is what we're used to an outcomes-based model or a payment by results model in certain dimensions, almost means political institutions need reimagining, right? So that is a whole thing in and of itself. It's a policy play too. And we are also seeing examples of that happening. The example or the analogy I often use is, the Fed or the Bank of England or the Reserve Bank of Australia. We outsource monetary policy, whereby it's still accountable to government, but experts are kind of deciding what the interest rates should be. And broadly, you could argue they were a bit slow in the last inflation crisis and in some countries, but broadly that seems to have worked, right? what would that look like if you had the bank of outcomes for education or for health or something, where public money was managed much more longitudinally? Perhaps we would start to invest in things that we've known for decades work, like early child development or mental health, all these things that don't get funded in existing budgets because they don't really work within a political cycle if it's a democracy, or it's too hard to work out what they look like. You could start to actually spend money in a really targeted way. And in terms of developed countries, one of the first countries to move in that direction has been Australia. They just announced, several hundreds of millions for central outcomes funding, which is, not enough, but it's a really good start because it's starting to, just again show the green shoots of what some of the infrastructure needs to look like in an impact economy. And I think one of the things that we've seen to be really excited, particularly in African context, is the ability for countries within Africa to leapfrog and actually design things way better than they are in the UK or other places, and build better systems that can hopefully scale and be more transparent. So I'm optimistic that those kinds of things can happen, but we also have to make them happen by working together, by coming up with good examples and really getting robust data about what works.
Yeah, Tom, I'd be ready to put my neck on the line that if we did some results-based financing models around tenders in Africa, we might find that what we save could actually even pay for meals, over and above delivering really good quality education, because there's so much in corruption and other just lack of delivery that I actually think it would probably give us more value for money, way more than we'd imagine. At this point in time, so we might be surprised if we start testing. And where AVPS stands, would be very keen to partner with anyone who wants to pilot and test some of these models on the continent. That momentum of a different thought process is, and especially public money, because public money, like it or not, is the largest pools of impact capital in any country. And we could almost solve a lot of our problems just by being a bit better and more efficient in how we utilize public money before even bringing in any other players. But Tom, so we've spoken a lot about other players. I want to talk about businesses. What can businesses, especially the financial services, do to drive impact economies?
So I think obviously I'll start with financial services, a business like mine. I think it's actually building products and services for our clients that meet their desired aims, although we are also heavily regulated, right? So we have to make sure that we don't overpromise, right? So the impact washing piece is really critical. But ultimately, I think it is about really thinking through how do we create, opportunities that drive the kind of impact that people are looking for, that also provide the kind of risk-adjusted return that different types of capital are seeking. So obviously a pension fund has to get a market rate return. They've got fiduciary duty. A family office can actually make an impact risk-adjusted return call. They can decide that they have to be paid in rhinos because the principal happens to love rhinos, right? And they can make these trade-offs, and that's value to them. I want to not use the word concession, because I don't think getting your return partially paid in impact is a concession if we believe that impact has an intrinsic and extrinsic value. And then of course there's that role of philanthropy. So I think it's incumbent on financial services to really think smartly about how you can build these kinds of vehicles, and that's where things like blended finance vehicles are so exciting. And in fact, they're outselling and outperforming impact investments now. Some research that we just had come out earlier this year. So I think those areas are critical. I think other businesses, and I was interested in the question that was earlier, that some people think business doesn't have a role to play. And I was wondered what was behind that thinking, but I'd say every business has an impact. I mean, they have impacts in their supply chain. They have impacts around, their trafficking policies. They have mental health issues that, that they can look at. And I think starting to be able to show the intentionality and additionality that a business's impact might be could be a source of revenue for that business, or it could be at least a tax deduction for them or their investors if they could prove it. So I think businesses starting to think about where they can directly have impact and measure it is actually quite interesting. And similarly, I think businesses also pay for impact. So the voluntary carbon market is actually driven by businesses wanting to offset their own carbon footprint, because we recognize that that's not a perfect part, but it's a part of a transition to net zero, is working out how we can still have economic growth yet also transition to a more sustainable economy. So I think businesses have a huge role to play ultimately, and then of course there is the traditional bit of what businesses do, which is also they do corporate philanthropy. I think that's where perhaps they could be smart too, just as we're talking about philanthropists being smart, is using that capital kind of catalytically.
Okay, cool. And you talk about intentionality and additionality, and that's a very important thing, especially when you're talking about the impact space. Most businesses, if not all, have impact, but not all of them have impact investing, if you know what I mean. Please, for the sake of the audience, unpack intentionality and additionality, just so that people understand what those mean and why those are important to bring those questions into these conversations.
Yeah, so you know, it's a little bit like I was saying in terms of the bond rating for impact. I think we often talk about additionality and intentionality and forget the evidence piece. So let's assume evidence quality is the most important, because you can have intentionality, can have additionality, but your quality of evidence might be a bit weaker. And therefore the value of that intentionality and additionality is different. But intentionality is, we as a business intend to drive this specific outcome, and we have measurements in place to do that. Additionality is each new bit of investment or capital that I get as a business is driving another new piece of investment rather than me, you know. So I mean, I guess a good example is if I buy a hectare of mangrove that someone else has reforested, I'm not having any additional impact. I might be the owner of it, but I'm not having any additional impact. Now, actually, I think we've got ourselves tied up in knots a little bit about additionality, because I actually think there is a value about, I think there's a long-term value to buy and hold and have liquidity for historic impact. And I think that's something that we need to kind of think through. You know, obviously, a hectare of mangrove that's already been pre-planted doesn't have the same value of one that's going to sequester. But if it had an annuity value, it perpetually, then that would actually help fix some of these issues around micro deforestation. So I think, you know, being smart around that is something that you know, I don't think we've solved it yet. In fact, again, on a call this morning, a brilliant concept about transfer of value, again, in mangrove areas, was creating micro markets whereby fishermen who've seen the benefit of increased fish stock yields because there's better mangrove preservation are paying the mangrove farmers 2-3 years later. They created micro markets for transfer of value. So there's different ways of kind of, you know, trying to create that opportunity. But I think that's critical. I mean, unless you've got a better the definition, Frank, that's the one I use.
No, that's good. The one I usually add to the intentionality piece is to ask the question is, does private capital go into a place where it will not on its own go? So through incentives like Athletic Capital and what have you, is private capital, for example, like mRNA is a good example.
Yeah.
The farmer were not ready to put money there. But once the proof of concept had been built, then they came behind and put that. So my big question around intentionality in the context of impact is are we seeing private capital go where on its own it do not go? If you're building a factory, for example, do you want to build it in Nairobi or in Lagos or Johannesburg, or do you want to go in the interior parts of those three countries and put the factory there, all factors being equal? Because the jobs that are needed are probably out of the cities and not so much in the cities of these big countries. So that's another lens I bring into when I look at intentionality. But we are aligned totally on the additionality piece. I think I look at it the same way too. If we think about, we've spoken quite a lot about different types of capital and financials and how that can be utilized. And I want to specifically look at just philanthropic capital. And there is arguably Gant has asked a very controversial question in the chat. Wouldn't it be easier to maximize the impact on the SDGs if philanthropic capital would focus on the triple bottom line for people, profit, and planet, and probably reinvest some of its profit again and again? So there's a real conversation going on now around philanthropic capital and the role that it has to play in this impact space. What are your thoughts around how we use philanthropy and its emerging role and evolving role as we go along in the journey to deliver more impact?
Yeah, I mean, look, in a very, very simplistic thought exercise, if there's 10 trillion in philanthropy, rather than that being invested in mainstream securities or whatever it is people do, diversified portfolios, and it paid 5% and they give away that money. If that 10 trillion could be invested and recycled, let's say every 3 years, or whatever the term is, then you get to 30. And now that's very simple. Another way of thinking about that is the concept of blended finance. So using some of this kind of corpus of philanthropic capital to deliberately and intentionally take risk positions in financial products that allow, to your definition of intentionality, which I like, and I'm gonna steal or add to mine, is to then drive money into places where it wouldn't otherwise. So to be truly catalytic in that sense. And again, 10 trillion on a 1-to-3 ratio adds up to 30. So, that's super simplistic. It's never going to quite work like that. But the beauty of thinking about 10 being invested for impact, even if that impact is a first loss position, even if some of it gets eroded and lost, is it should still generate some form of return. Like most of the blended finance type structures or direct impact deals that we, seen our clients do generate returns, often inflation plus returns. So you can even still make grants off money invested that way, if that's sense. So it's not about and or, like no grants, everything impact investing. It's just about both and. It's about making that precious resource of philanthropy work as hard as possible for impact in multiple dimensions. And I think on maybe just a tangible example on a where we've seen kind of the power of blended finance. So the cost of a student loan for a young woman in Rwanda is about 40% APR, 40% to try and get a tertiary education. So really what's going to happen there is she'll either not take the loan, she'll try and get a scholarship, there's one in 1,000 get a scholarship, or she'll take the loan and be saddled with hugely unsustainable debts. That's what the market says the price is. That's what the market says the risk is. We did a very simple blended finance instrument with Chanson, an amazing partner in the Future of Work Fund, whereby philanthropists took a $10 million first loss position, which de-risked the whole fund to the extent that we managed to persuade institutional investors to lend at 4, not 40. Partly because we also showed the track record of what that whole 21 million pool was investing in, which was income share agreements. So not student loans in the traditional sense, but an income share agreement. Again, an impact economy kind of concept whereby you have an agreement with both the student, but also the academic institution. The academic institution is liable for 20% of any losses. So they aren't mis-selling courses. So you're much more likely, hopefully, to get people into employment or entrepreneurship, and then they can repay that capital. And the historic performance of these income share agreements has been about a 9% fund level return. So the philanthropists were going to get that 9%, the institutional capital get 4%. That's just win-win. And those kinds of models are pretty scalable. 10,000 students and 21 million, that's about 700 million of lifetime economic value. If you were to apply that to the 500 million people who might need education financing, it would only cost, and I say only, about 500 billion. Now, the alternate model, the traditional philanthropy model, would need 60 trillion to give an endowment-based scholarship to 500 billion people, right? So that's never going to happen. Philanthropy cannot give scholarships to everyone who wants it. But these kind of innovative instruments, 500 billion, that could actually potentially obviously that's almost an entire asset class in student financing. And I know there's a good practitioners and bad practitioners, but that's a kind of example whereby philanthropic capital is actually building entire new asset classes, which we learn the track record of. And 2-3 iterations down the road, it will no longer need any philanthropic capital. It won't need subsidy because people will understand the risks, and they'll understand that any other income country where they're being currently priced out through what I think is market failure, actually they're good credit risks. That we should be investing in them, and it's good for the global economy to do so. So I think that's one is part of the power of really thinking about how you can use that philanthropic capital to lever in investment capital and allow investors, in fact, to invest in a place that they otherwise are being told is too risky for them to invest.
Okay, cool. We're getting close to the Q&A session, so please do get ready with your questions. And what I'm actually going to try and do differently today is that I'll ask you to unmute and ask your question directly. Like, Alan, your question is too smart for me. So I know we're talking about political risk. So I'll ask you, Alan, in a couple of minutes, once I ask Tom the next question, for you to unmute and ask your question around political risk. So Tom, we know UBS has been around. It's done a lot of good stuff. Do you have any examples where UBS has used philanthropic capital differently as risk capital in doing some of this work? We're talking about crowding in private capital. What kind of leverage have you achieved? And do you have any African examples that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so the example I just mentioned is one, obviously, in the income share agreement. The example I mentioned in the context of Ghana earlier, and I should clarify because I saw in a question, which I completely agree with, not suggesting that kids aren't going to have a meal. What we're saying is the decision was not to feed the kids. So actually what you end up doing is educating children whose families can afford to send them to school with a meal. so it's not the very base of the pyramid, but it's maybe the next level up, right? And those are hard choices. But the risk capital for that contract that we invested was actually raised in a blended finance vehicle, whereby 20% was philanthropic capital, taking a first loss position, similar to what I described earlier, but just a different leverage ratio. And 80% is two different tranches of investment capital playing different returns. And that's been raised as kind of a, like a private equity type fund that can invest in any outcomes contract. I would say 70% will probably end up being in Africa. But it's got a global mandate. So that's the largest pay for results on the risk capital side that's been built to date. And that was enabled because actually we'd done the policy work, working with governments, working with bilateral agencies over the last 4 or 5 years to get them to commit to start using some of their budgets to pay for results. So those are a couple of examples. But I'm conscious we're short on time, so I won't give you any more.
Yeah, no worries. But just one more follow-on comment to what you said. You paid for the policy result. Do you feel the evidence you're collecting through some of these models that you're implementing are being taken up by governments in policy iteration and policy revisions? Do you think we're winning that battle of making governments think differently?
I mean, as with any battle, I think you take 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards sometimes. But yeah, broadly, look, when I started in this space 14 years ago, in payment by results 14 years ago, I've been working for 20 years in the nonprofit and then UBS for 10. I saw the first pilot in payment for results. I think people hoped it would be adopted globally within 5 years, but the reality is they're complicated to structure. There's not incentives within government to move in that direction. I think a lot of people assume that it's a great deal to only pay for results, right? It is for the electorate, it is for the taxpayer. It's not necessarily for the civil servant who's going to lose their budget if they don't spend it, right? So some of the incentives within government are quite complicated, and have to work in partnership to make sure, and actually again, like we were working in India in one context, the intervention through a payment by results mechanism was doing 800% of the outcome of the government control. I mean, if you put that in the media, you could destroy your relationship and your partnership in terms of kind of supporting and educating. So it has to be done in a very sensitive way in terms of transitioning people into that direction.
Okay, cool. Alan, I'm going to come to you right now. In a short while to your question, and DJ, I'm going to come to you as well. So on the report, Tom, before you go to the Q&A, do you have any closing remarks on the report before we take any questions? Any highlights? Any things that you think the audience should really try and get out of the report?
Look, I mean, I think our intention of putting that out there is we want to build partnerships with people who also feel like they're working towards building an impact economy. So, the first and foremost thing is, build partnerships with if you're a philanthropist, with impact investors. For an impact investor, look at the kind of blended finance thing, see where we can go deeper. Definitely think about the impact transparency piece. We would love to talk to, and that's why we're partnering with AVPA and all the other philanthropy networks globally to try and build consensus around what's needed. And I think that's the really critical thing. And I suppose going back to that point you were saying, Frank, in terms of working with government, what we've seen be really ineffective is if the sector, people who care about impact, speak with lots of different voices, right? Whereas if we speak with one voice, we're much more likely to see the systems change that we want to see in order to kind of pull some of the levers with the impact economy. So I think that message around partnerships is absolutely critical.
Cool. Alan Fowler, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? I think you'll do it much better than I would.
Most gracious of you, Frank. Thank you for the invitation. Just so that I put it in the chat, I'm a professor in African philanthropy at the Wits Business School. And over the years, I've been observing, whether it's NDGs or SDGs, that a factor very often that impedes the sort of continuity that's needed in looking towards longer term outcomes and simply inputs, is that we want these countries that are wanting money to be as democratic as possible, which means that elections come and go, and so do regimes. And we don't use the word regime enough. We should, because that eventually is what exercises political authority over the government. So I just, it's not really a question, it's an observation. What is it in terms of the investment metrics or the investment risk calculations that are being made that take democratic regime transition into account? Let's not talk about the undemocratic transitions, which we see in some African countries at the moment. But it is a disruptor. Democracy is a disruptor, also in Europe. So how does that get factored in to the sort of calculus, and who does it?
I mean, Alan, I think you're 100% right. Actually, that the political cycle is one of the restraining factors we've seen in developed democracies for longitudinal thinking when it comes to public expenditure. So, I don't think any of us have the perfect solution, but I think one of the concepts which I was describing, which I think potentially has merit, is this idea of political institutions that benefit whichever government's in power. Like, at the end of the day, if you can prove causally that you're providing public benefits, you're getting better results, i.e. kids are being educated, or you are reversing diabetes, or any of these kinds of things which cost your economy and cost people their quality of life. If you can prove that your public expenditure is having a benefit, then mostly whoever's in power likes that. So I think this idea of trying to think about the institutions that could still be accountable to the government could still set the policy direction on what they want to pay for, but are more longitudinal, is one way of thinking about how we can weather the political cycle. And we've seen, again, not perfect, but grassroots of examples of this, where we've had, public-private partnerships that have transitioned in African countries in particular, over a 10-year political cycle, and they've kept the same policy because the data was so strong. And in fact, in one context, somebody was telling me earlier this year that the incoming political party tried to kind of kick this particular policy, saying it was really, really bad. And actually, in those constituencies, they didn't do very well because the voters knew that their kids were learning. So I think it was kind of interesting that data and impact is a fact, and that's the thing I think sometimes that people forget. We can talk about all the science, but if it's actually happening, people will see that it's actually happening, and they'll value it. I think from a political institution perspective, no one has got the right answer yet, but I do think some of this transition to trying to make it more longitudinal and ring fencing percentages of budgets into those kinds of institutions is one way in which we could maybe model that, and perhaps that's something that can be modeled in other countries. I mean, I would say that arguably, and again, I don't want to kind of get into a kind of political conversation here, but there are countries like Singapore where they are very longitudinal, and they have been able to spend money in that way, and you can see some benefits as a result of that. I'm not saying advocating for not having that kind of change in political cycle, because obviously that's something that many of us think of is very important. But I think we do need to think about how we can also have that longitudinal planning of public expenditure.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom. Enjoyable.
Thank you. DJ, are you there?
Yes, DJ is here, Frank. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me. Siku sana. How's Nairobi? I hope you're well.
Simbaya. It's sunny today. There's no rain, although it may rain a bit later, because right now we're in the unpredictable season, isn't it? And we've got El Nino coming up, so plenty of us to be mindful. So Tom, thanks very much, and Frank for moderating. And the thing for me is, and that's what my question is about, and actually also the follow-on question is that we keep on talking about philanthropic, we keep on talking about impact investing, we keep on talking about development finance, but at the same time, if we look at the world at large, holistically, then with the declining populations in the global north, at some point there is a lot of dependency on the global south population. So it's not about impact say in a country now, is it? It's about being selfish and being actually looking at a much larger scale, making sure that the world as is can continue to thrive to some extent, or can thrive together.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And that, that's why I always start almost every talk I give with that stat that, and again, it's an extrapolation, it's an estimate, but if we actually enable people, I mean, the SDGs are pretty simple. It's like growing up in safe environments. It's like, not having the effects of climate change affect people, but it's also the building blocks, health, education, these fundamentals. If the global workforce, if human capital is enabled to fulfill its potential, it adds value to all of us, right? Then your labor supply can fill those gaps, as you say. The modeling in Japan, I can't remember the exact details, but it is kind of the current modeling. I think the population depletes by 70% in 120 years' time. I mean, where are they going to find all the people to come and go and man their industry? And if they're not educated and supported, then you're looking at massive major recessions because we haven't actually pre-invested in solving some of these issues. So I think you're really, really right, and then we shouldn't lose sight of that longitudinal economic value. I think one of the big challenges, of course, is that the way the whole system, and this is, I guess, the output-based economy is measured in quarters often, right? So it's very short term, whereas we need to be kind of a little bit more medium and long term if we're going to solve some of these issues, so we can get the full benefit. But yeah, I completely agree with you. They're very global in nature, and in some senses, you're right. I think not talking about philanthropy and this kind of capital, it's just the economy. The economy needs to benefit us all, and we need to value the things that are ultimately valuable. And that's really what we were attempting to start a dialogue around with this concept of impact economy.
But see, on that note, isn't it quite counterintuitive that multilateral organizations lend money to the lower and middle income countries with this risk adjusted interest rates, because it's exactly the opposite what should be done. How is it that the Netherlands can borrow at 1% or 0.5%, and Kenya needs to pay 14%, and then on top of that they need to borrow in US dollars? So you're getting a double whammy with the FX being hammered on you.
Yeah, and at the same time, people are giving away billions of dollars into those economies, which actually, if they were just underwriting the debt and priced it at the right price, maybe you would actually get the economy functioning. So I think that's exactly the kinds of market failures, I call it, that we need to try and point out and address. And I think, at least sitting in my seat, meeting some of the people I've met who have huge pools of capital, they're kind of willing to do that, but we need to build the opportunity set for them to do it in a way that meets those different requirements. But I completely agree with you.
Yeah, DJ, to your point, I think one of the ways we can solve this problem is if we unlock a lot more local capital that comes out in local currency, and it's something we as AVP are going to be trying to look into. There's money sitting in pension funds. How do we manage and work with them through their risk perceptions to unlock more capital for impacts on the continent? And we've also got to look at some Afro-unique pots of capital. We need to look at, there's a lot of money sitting in faith-based organizations. Churches and mosques have a lot of cash on this continent. People think Africans don't necessarily give, but we give a lot to our religious organizations. We need to look at some other types of capital, like not diaspora remittances, but diaspora savings, as something else we could look at. But bottom line, we've got to be thinking about how do we unlock local private capital, because traditionally things like DFIs that are supposed to come and help some of these things are not really doing their job. They're seeking market returns like everyone else, and they were supposed to come and bridge the gap between aid and private capital. So we, at the end of the day, have to think of African-led solutions, because so long as we're not in charge of the capital, we're always going to be beggars and not rule makers. We're going to be rule takers. And that's something we've got to wake up to as Africans. We need to think about how do we make better use of, and this comes back to the conversation we're having earlier, how do we make better use of existing public finances, and how do we unlock new local capital that's not dollar denominated, that then we can use at more acceptable returns on the continent. So anyway, that's a conversation, DJ. When I'm in Nairobi, I will find you for over coffee and we can have an excellent conversation. Oh, I forgot, by the way, Tom, before I forget, you had DJ's Kiswahili. The good thing of being part of the AP network, you learn an African language. So feel very free to join us at any point in time. Ganta, are you unmuted? Can you ask your question? I know we didn't answer it. Gunta, are you there? Are you unmuted, Gunta?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Well, I am a fundraiser for impact-oriented startups and venture funds. Actually, I'm in Berlin. Yesterday, we had a nice meeting with Tonic, and today I'm with Clementum Venture, an impact-oriented venture capital company. I believe that philanthropic money could increase its impact if it would more focus on the triple bottom line for people, planet, and profit, reinvesting part of the profit again and again and again. What do you think about this?
I mean, I completely agree, Gunther. I think the challenge I've seen over my career is convincing people that what we would call a recyclable philanthropic investment, and I use that term deliberately because it's not regulated. So as soon as something is an actual impact investment and you have to distribute it, I see my old colleague Jamie on the call, will know this well, where we talk to the FCA about how you actually distribute some of these things. As soon as it's regulated, you obviously have to demonstrate that it's a market risk adjusted return. And I think some of the trade-offs when you want to have a market risk adjusted return is that you may not be able to drive some of the impact that you want to see because, for example, the business that you're investing in, whilst you think it's having an impact, it can't afford to measure it properly, right? So you can't actually prove that it's impactful, and therefore, can you sell it as impactful? So I think the actual the number of opportunities where I would say, if we were to use a bond rating example, a AAA, where you've got guaranteed impact, particularly targeting those most affected by inequality in low and middle income countries, and at a scalable, which is critical if you're really going to solve issues, are tiny. But on the flip side, I think if we can increase the pool, and maybe it doesn't need to be AAA, it doesn't need to be perfect. It can be BBB, it can be, good data, and maybe it's not the very poorest, but it's still, moving the dial for people who, who want to see impact, or moving the dial on climate. If we can start to offer more of those solutions, I've no doubt that people will put more and more capital into those things. We've been recommending philanthropic investments to our clients in the 10 years I've been at UBS. Mm-hmm. And I think we've probably allocated about $1 billion to different things we recommend now, of which 200 million is in exactly on the terms that you're describing. It's recyclable. They're getting both income and yield off that money. And what we find is that once people start to realize that they can use their philanthropy in that way, then they're hooked. Because actually, if you can drive the kind of impact that you're used to getting when you're giving money away, and get your money back, what's not to like, right? Why wouldn't you keep doing that? And the only reason you wouldn't keep doing that is if it's not in the area you want to see. So, as I mentioned, we have one client who wants to do early child development in Mongolia. There's no way that we could find that you can invest money, make money, and get guaranteed impact in that dimension in Mongolia. So, what do you do? Well, you start building the impact economy in that concept in Mongolia. You work with government, you find partners, you put all the building blocks in place so that you can make it investable in the future. So I think if we have that mindset, which is the end goal is as you describe, and we try and get there as fast as we can with our philanthropy, then we'll build the impact economy much more rapidly.
Tom, you've been awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time. What I'd like you to do, Tom, just as a closing remark, do you have any final remarks to make to the audience, and do you have a particular call to action for the audience?
I mean, I would just say keep doing what you're doing. Thank you for caring about impact. Thank you for trying to solve all the different issues that you are, allocating capital in this way, asking these difficult questions, and don't lose heart as well, because I think sometimes being an impact. My team I call impact chasers. We're all chasing it. We all want this world where we can get, the triple bottom line that Gunther was talking about. But sometimes it can be demoralizing and hard work. Don't give up. My experience is that if we try 5 things, at least 1 or 2 will work. And we have to keep persevering. And it's I think it's a really exciting time to be in this space. And I'm delighted to have been invited. Thank you very much.
So Tom, I'm going to ask you my question, which we all have this dream of mainstreaming. At least I have. When I look at the vision that we have as AVP and my personal vision, why I'm so passionate about this work is, do you think my dream of one day seeing profit and purpose being mainstream in the world a reality? Is that am I dreaming
No,
bubbles, or is
I
that?
think it's inevitable. I think it's inevitable. I mean, just as the 10 years, you know, when even in Paris in 2015, if I'm not sure we would have predicted the kind of regulatory environment. I know there's been a backlash in the US and things on net zero and things, but you know, the chairman of my bank, which is one of the largest, you know, wealth managers in the world, as I said at the beginning, just, you know, stood up to all of our senior leaders, and you know, sustainability is a trend. It's just not going away, and I think impact is lagging. You know, sustainability tends to kind of mean progress towards net zero. I think wider impact outcomes across more of the other issues described in the Sustainable Development Goals is lagging that, but it's definitely going to come, because you know we have to do that, to the point that came up earlier. If we don't actually invest in our human capital, if we don't solve the issues around biodiversity and climate, you know, if we don't have healthy workforce, you know, we won't grow as economies, we won't flourish as human beings. So I think it is inevitable, but I think it will also take the hard work of lots of people, I'm sure all of whom are on this call, to lean in and also make it happen by working together in partnership. Yeah,
exactly. And just to touch a bit on one or two questions that have popped in just now about what are the next steps. This conversation we're having today is a core part of the ongoing conversations and the actions that we as a membership network are trying to make core and for the forefront of the key difficult conversation that everyone is having about how do we drive Africa's sustainable impact. So Sakile, to your question, how are you planning to put this innovation into action? At AVPA, we realize this is something we've got to do for the continent. This continent is in a difficult space. Aid to Africa is declining, and declining very fast. Our government's public debt is growing, so we don't have that much government funding. I think you look across Africa, especially post-COVID, our governments are broke. We're paying for infrastructure and playing an infrastructure catch-up game. So there isn't that much money coming to this space. So we've got to get creative in how we do these things. So the conversation today and the need for a different path to Africa's sustainable development is exactly what we're engaging in. And this is where we everything we do is towards that paradigm shift. The training programs we run, the research we do, the conversations we have, the convenings we're building, the communities of impact we're creating, the kind of membership we're growing is all about trying to advance this conversation. So that is a big part of what we do. And Elizabeth, to your question about the most reports part of Africa not being attractive spaces for investment, this is the contrast that impact investors have. Impact investors go where problems exist, okay, and they find a way of making those opportunities work. Okay, so how do you get more capital in these areas? This is why I was talking about the intentionality of impact investing. You feel free to catch up with me later, Elizabeth, but there's a case study from Mexico where there was a business that was running a diabetes practice, healthcare practice, that was only working in the peri-urban areas. And these guys were running efficiently, not see any need to grow. And someone said, but your model has worked. Why don't you go into rural areas? And they said, rural areas are too risky. We don't understand them. Exactly the questions you've put in here, Elizabeth. And someone said, I will pay for your risk to go and test your model out there to prove that there might be an opportunity. So someone funded this organization. They went into the rural areas. They tested their model with a few tweaks and actually realized that it works. And thereafter, the investors actually invested in the countrywide expansion of that business. That's the power of impact investing. Is the risk capital, the philanthropic capital, comes in to try and test the scale and replication of some of proven models or innovation of new ones. And that's why this is an exciting space. What were previously shameful African problems are exciting impact opportunities. The glass is no longer half empty, it's half full. We just have to work to see how we can fill it up. And that's what we need to do. So we need to be very comfortable being uncomfortable with experimentation and testing new things. And that's why Africa is probably the best impact sandbox you could get. Our problems are exciting impact opportunities. And anything that works in Africa is globally scalable because it's been tested in the extreme of conditions. Okay, so as an impact player in Africa, you're in the best place. We should be creating the Ivy League of impact in the next 5 to 10 years. People should be coming to us to learn about impact. Okay, so this is an exciting time to be an African impact player. And as you talk about these things, this is where we need to start and see, okay, how do we get a philanthropist to help fund an innovation or a solution to get healthcare access to those remote rural communities? And with the technology we have of the cell phone and other things that's upcoming, there are possibilities, and possibilities that we can grow for the benefit of our people. Without further ado, Tom, thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, Abby, thank you. Can we move on? Anything else?
Frank, can you just share your email address in the chat, please?
I will do that right now. And also, please do find me on LinkedIn. I'll put in my email address right now. Give me a second. There it goes. Okay. Others, thank you very much, everyone. Really great. Look out for our next set of webinars. We're always having interesting conversations. Those of you who would like to join us as members, really cool stuff we're looking to do, and we'd like to be part of this. We'd like to share with you what you're trying to do. But thank you so much for making time.